See, I think first is having a very clear view that culture is important. The initial team that comes together, they drive, what are the key parameters you kind of will live by, right? Is it innovation? Is it customer focus? Is it people focus? Is it a combination of all of these three things? And I think you hire those type of people. You bring in, people with similar values and similar culture or cultural bent of mind. And over time, you also probably start to see that only those type of people, flock around and remain with the company.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. Kanti Prabha is the co-founder of SirionLabs, one of the leading SaaS startups out of India. They operate in the contract lifecycle management space. And in this conversation, I speak to Kanti about building for the large enterprise, what it takes, what are the various nuances, and how if you play your cards right and optimize for customer happiness, large enterprises could be one of the best customers to have. Kanti has spent a lot of time in product and operations and understands the various nuances associated with scaling a startup. And in this conversation, that's really what I try to draw out. There are plenty of insights in here on SaaS and product and operations that could be really relevant to you. So let's get started on this episode of the Startup Operator Podcast with Kanti Prabha. Hey, Kanti, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much, Roshan, for having me. And I really look forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, it's always great to talk to someone from SaaS because I have a personal interest as well. I work in this domain, and also it's something that has really come to the fore of late, right? I mean, in the last couple of years, especially, the world has SaaSified in some sense, but it wasn't like this maybe 10 or 12 years back, right? When, you first joined SirionLabs and so on, right? So could you take us through that evolution that you've seen firsthand?
Absolutely. I think from being a one-off business model, SaaS has become now one of the most valuable business models to build companies. Right. I was reading recently that Gartner says that it'll probably be more than $150 billion this year, just SaaS revenue itself. And I think 15 years ago when we were building products, it was literally, unheard of. It was not something that was common. And in the last decade, if you see, SaaS has moved from we going out there selling the product as sales folks, etc., in order to get business, to being more of a product-driven model, where the product attracts you towards it. Marketing and social have become so big in themselves, and SaaS has, attached itself onto it. And the product itself is designed to get more customers, and it plays a big role in customer perception. So I see SaaS, evolve so much over the last decade and more. The other thing I think is AI and ML now have started to play a very big role in SaaS. And I think they will continue to be a very big part of the future of SaaS, including, I think, Web 3.0. We're still to explore where that is going to go. But AI, ML, I think, are here to stay. In the contract management space itself, in the last few years, every contract management player has had to demonstrate their AI chops. And you just can't get away with a lightweight offering. You have to be really good at it. So I think overall, SaaS in itself brings in a lot of flavors of, company building, product building, which are very unique to itself. For example, from an ops perspective, I feel that the importance of the customer, their experience is now larger than ever. There is literally no product that can be successful if the customer and their happiness is not at the forefront of product building, company building. And so customer success seems to be the next big thing.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very interesting point that you bring up, right? Which is the customer love and customer delight that has become so important right now. It wasn't like this, earlier, where somebody would sock someone with a piece of software and then, vanish. And for years after, I mean, people would continue to use it begrudgingly, right? I mean, today we're in the whole switch on, switch off kind of a world, and completely decentralized as well, right? Individual smaller teams can take these kind of autonomous decisions and so on, right? So it's very interesting. In fact, one of my favorite stories of recent times is the fact that apparently one of the significant revenue streams for Snapdeal is from a SaaS software as well that they have, right? I mean, who would have thought of that? So
Wow, who would have
yeah.
thought? Absolutely.
Yeah. So this contract lifecycle management is a very interesting space, right? I mean, it's pretty complex because I don't think people on the outside kind of think of contracts as maybe the couple of NDAs they would have signed, or maybe some vendor agreements they would have had and so on. But there's a lot more complexity to it, especially with large enterprises, right? With terms changing and plenty of stakeholders involved and like real consequences to things not being right. So could you take us through like a 101 of what contract lifecycle management is?
Sure. So contracts themselves, they are really the lifeblood of global businesses, or any business for that matter, right? Yeah. When any two companies talk to each other, it is through contracts. And they contain the promises that both parties make to each other. It is the basis of the relationship, and it's very nuanced. It's full of strategy. They may appear, dry from the outside, complex, boring even, but there is so much nuance and strategy that goes into drafting these contracts. It's actually very interesting. And, all of these years I have spent reading contracts, working with folks who write contracts or understand them or manage them. A lot of them are lawyers. So I have loads of lawyer friends that I've collected over life, and they're some of the most interesting, type of people. My personal interest in contract management is also because this is a real world problem, that contracts are largely manual. They are very unstructured. They're written in text. So therefore, knowing what is in it, is a difficult exercise. And if these contracts are not written well, not managed well, they have an impact on revenue and spend. They have an impact on global businesses. And just being a part of this, the contract management revolution that is happening, when people or, companies were not able to find their contracts, and now they're using AI to understand what is in it. They're, using technology in order to write better contracts, write contracts which write themselves, as opposed to, painful human intervention. And they use technology all the time to manage their contracts and tell them what is the risk that these documents carry in them. So it's an area that is very conducive to optimization, automation, intelligence. And so technically it's it's an architect and a developer's dream to be able to work on a space like this. From a product perspective, so many different types of stakeholders who touch contracts. And so, building something is like this is very challenging, but very, very interesting. You could spend decades building, products in this space and not get bored of it at all.
Yeah, no, I feel like it's very programmable, right? I mean, it's very logical, programmable, and it lends itself to so many nuances as well that it would be a very ripe problem for someone to solve. So when you started out with Sirion, I think it was perhaps in the nascency, right? In terms of the space and category itself. I mean, today, there are multi-$100 million or $1 billion enterprises in the space. There's perhaps a Gartner quadrant, a Forrester wave, and whatnot, right? Today, it's a mature category. When you go from that sort of a nascent category to like a mature category as it is right now, what are some of those changes that you experience? I mean, do customers come seeking out a particular solution to you? I mean, do you have do you get to be at the table more often? And from a product and ops perspective, what changes?
So that's a very interesting question. And like any other category in the making, right? So it's not like contract management didn't exist. It existed probably, forever now, since there were contracts. Just the way it was being managed was completely manual, without any technology, around it. Tech came in the late 90s in many different ways. And then the initial versions of contract management in the early 2000s, you start to see, some of those companies built in the late 2000s now, becoming much more mature products. But it is literally this decade, this last decade that has gone, which saw tech play a true role. It was not just about, let me be a system of record, and, a place to, just store contracts or dump contracts. It started to, help create contracts. Tech started to play a role where certain human tasks were taken away. Certain, mundane, boring review type of capabilities were completely automated. Intelligence started to come into the entire process, where looking at past data, you were able to, start to understand, okay, if these were the decisions taken in the past, how can I, reproduce those decisions in the future without involving a human yet again? So there was a lot of, hope and innovation that got into the contract management space. But having said that, I think it's still very early days. There is still so much to do in contract management. Contracts are still written in a unique manner. They're not programmable elements. They're still not, check, and, here's your contract ready to be managed. They have a lot of uniqueness built into them because that represents the business nuance. But there is just, I mean, from a tech perspective, so much still to be done in the space, especially with the use of AI, especially with the use of advanced automation techniques, the ability to look at, very large volumes of data and understanding and unearthing business decisions from it, and keep the human intervention more, judgment-based activities. So yeah, I think the space has evolved. It was slow in the beginning, but it's a red hot space right now.
Yeah. No, it's actually, I would say it's still in its nascency in terms of the transition, right? When you're talking about transitioning from a system of record to perhaps something like a system of insights or system of intelligence, I think that latter half, I think is still, I would say the use cases are still developing, I would say, right? So take us back to the early days. What was it like acquiring your first 10 customers and as someone who had to build the product out, right? So how did you approach that? And, what are some lessons from that journey that you've carried along the way?
So the first 10 customers are almost always those who will mold your company. They will shape the product. They will provide feedback. They will tell you what to build. They will have, every customer will have, especially enterprise customers, they always have a very different perspective of what value means to them. They will help complete, your discovery of pricing. What does a minimum viable product need to have? Where does, your product sit in the entire ecosystem of other products? What do you have to integrate with? So the first, your initial 10 customers, they really, help build out the entire product, and also what your company will eventually, end up being. A key lesson that I think we learned is that you will get a lot of feedback from many different directions, and you have to learn, and it's a painstaking learning, is that you have to maintain a balanced point of view, because you can always be swayed, in a particular direction with, one or two customers, and that, may take away all the money that you have, or, it may create a product which is more niche than generic, and that may not work for other types of enterprises, only a particular type of enterprise, and so on. So maintaining that balanced point of view is very important, and having your own research, your own analysis to go along with what your customer is asking for is very important. I remember one of our first 10 customers, actually, they helped us scale about 100x in our first few years from a product building perspective. So, from an architecture perspective, scale, flexibility, it was 100x jump. So, if other customers were storing a few hundred contracts, these guys were storing, hundreds of thousands of contracts on the platform. And it was just, the challenge was so daunting, and, something that we had never seen before. And you kind of, when you encounter that type of an experience in the first few years, it probably looks impossible, but then it is so exciting, right? to be able to build a product of true scale, a product that, can withstand millions of contracts running through it, billions of dollars of value running through it. And that pivot or, that stage of product building was very interesting and very helpful for, where we are today. So I think the first 10 customers, they help you in many, many different ways. But while they do that, you also obviously, need to be careful of the directions that they take you on. And, what do you do about, carefully treading in those directions?
That's a great point, because I think the initial journey, not being swayed in different directions, being able to abstract the why that, somebody is asking for a particular feature or certain things, and generalize for the market and not just for a particular customer, I think is the key thing there. The other nuance is that this contract lifecycle management is sort of large enterprise focused, right? I mean, you guys focus on the larger organizations and so on. So what are some of the nuances of building for these large enterprises?
So yeah, our focus has been, companies greater than, 5 billion, 10 billion, 20, $30 billion companies. And building for large enterprises, it has many flavors. I'll break it down into a few perspectives. One is from a product building perspective. First things that while their requirements may, from afar look very similar, every large organization is very unique in its operating style, in its company structures, in its contract structures. So therefore, the product that you build has to actually be truly flexible, and flexible from, platform capability perspectives, security, access controls. These are all table stakes. So flexibility and the ability to mold yourself to any corporate, structure, environment, stakeholder type is literally the most important thing, or something that you just can't do without. So that's one. And second, regulatory needs, particularly, at least in the contract management space, play a very important role in molding your product's architecture and the certifications that you have. So from a product perspective, I think that's one, that you don't know what you're going to get. And if you sell to one enterprise and you have 100 more to go, you have to be ready for the 100 at get-go, because it's not easy to build on the fly. So you have to have a minimum level of complete capabilities which are broad enough to begin with. The second is from a sales perspective. So unless it's a very niche product, you need to identify who are the right stakeholders, who is the buyer, who has the budget, who are the supporters, who are the influencers, who are going to play a critical role in expediting these sales cycles. So understanding who you're working with, who's going to be the eventual person who's going to pick up the software and pay the many millions is important. RFPs are very common, especially in red ocean spaces where there are many other products. So you have to be regularly up against competition and prove your worth in different scenarios against many different products as well. So that's something that one has to be ready for, which is not common in, products which are not in those domains. You can still get away without, RFPs and without having those types of very processized methods of, selling. Third, I think, which I think all companies who are building for enterprises should keep in mind, is your visibility with analysts. So analysts like Gartner, Forrester, and many others in their respective spaces, they play a very influential role in evangelizing the best and the brightest solutions that are there. And it is important, even if you're a very young company, to be able to tell analysts that, okay, this is what we're building, this is the space that we're in. If it's a category that does not exist, it's important to start, having those conversations with them, keep them in the loop of what you're building, why you're different, why you're better, what is the vision, etc. Because they will, either it's an existing category, or over time, a category will get built and you will be thought of during that time. So I think analysts are very important. And last but not the least, I think in the enterprise space, we no longer have the luxury to build boring looking products or really painful to use products. It's not enough anymore to build a minimum viable product, but a minimum delightful product is the MVP is really what you need to build, because that is what is needed in order to woo enterprises. Enterprises are also becoming very, savvy in buying. It's, no longer other, time of, 10-year, 15-year deals. They're also they understand what are the changes that are happening in the market. They want the best products out there. And customer happiness, I will, probably stress on this again and again. It has to be at the center of it all. If one can show real value and the customers understand what your product is bringing to them, enterprise businesses can be very sticky. So you will end up actually building a lot of very lasting relationships with customers once, those you've served even, let's say 10 years ago. And the process can be very gratifying as well. So I think it all boils down to what is the type of product that you've built and how deeply did you invest in understanding the customer, their requirements, and having that conversation with them of what is needed.
Right. Yeah, great insights. I think one of the things also is that, this CLM is extremely horizontal, right? I mean, you serve multiple industries. And just intuitively, you can assume that, financial services works very differently, or rather, there are significant differences compared to, let's say, manufacturing or something else, right? So when you have a horizontal solution and you're taking it to these different customers, right? How do you think about productizing the last mile for these folks? What do you say yes to? What do you say no to? What do you say that, hey, I'm going to probably integrate with an existing player, so on and so forth. So how do you make those decisions?
So actually, all of those elements that you talked about, first and foremost, I think it's important to understand that horizontal solution does not mean it's going to be shallow, and it does not need that, that finesse in each and every part, and that, custom or specific endpoints, they're not taken care of, it's fine. This is also because the audience for each particular type of, or part of your solution can actually be very different. If it's a financial services company, their needs after a particular point will be very specific, right? And you can't just stop there and say, I stop here, go figure out, what you need specifically somewhere else or manually or, with another product. You have to think all elements end to end, and not just from an industry perspective, but also from a stakeholder perspective. Because in areas like contract management, it's not just, legal who's the only stakeholder. There's legal, there's contract management themselves, there is finance, there is regulatory folks involved, there is business. There are so many different types of stakeholders, and they all need something different. Their perception of value is different. So you have to not just build a generic layer, but you have to pick each one of those and have a very clear plan of, which are the segments I'm attacking, which are the stakeholders I'm going to go after, and what is the minimum that they need in order to feel, happy, not just barely satisfied. And we've always, over the years, have had roadmaps. We've had matrices, which are, very clearly highlighting the different types of stakeholders, the different use cases in different industries, and have a very clear view of which would be areas that, we see as the up and coming areas where the need is the strongest, and where there are areas where we can, contribute technically from a domain expertise wise, etc. So it's important to have that view and to keep hacking at the problem, because enterprise class products, especially horizontal ones, you don't stop at, year 1, year 2, year 3. You keep going. And these are some of the directions you would take over time, where you become specialists in a particular area while you provide a very strong, multi-domain, multi-industry, multi-stakeholder solution.
Right. From everything you've said so far, right? I mean, it seems as though product building in the enterprise is very much with the customer, right? I mean, you're building with the customer and it's very close and collaborative and stuff. But at the same time, you also have to have your own perspective about the product, about the market, and so on. Otherwise, you will be swept in 1,000 different ways, right? How do you develop this perspective about the market? How do you develop that special insight that this is what I think enterprises should adopt, and here is the general direction in which I'm going to build? While I'm going to listen to people, here is where I will sort of shepherd everyone. So how do you develop that perspective?
So a very interesting question. It's a very difficult one to answer as well. In my experience, there are three ingredients that form the direction that you would take year on year. The first is customer influence. What do your customers want? The second is your own ideas about the space. Where do you want to take the space, the category? And where is the market heading? Because you are a part of a river, it is flowing in a particular direction. So, your ideas will be influenced regularly by the market as well. And the third, which is really a stepchild, which we rarely, give focus to, is what technical innovations can happen in this space that can radically and exponentially change the pace of, what the product can offer. So these are the three areas that we've always kept, a very close eye on and given them equal importance. It's like a dance. So, when you're building with a customer, you have a lot of advantages. They will become your design partners. They will, even give you all the domain expertise you need. They will be the early users. They will help you build the roadmap out as well. But few things that we need to be careful about is what they know is only what their organization needs, right? What they don't know is all the permutation combination of requirements. And it is our job to extrapolate and build for common good, not just in, the one particular direction. Personally, on an average, I've spent about 2 to 3 hours every day the past, I think, 14, 15 years talking to customers, listening to them, understanding the sources of, what makes them happy, what makes them sad, or what gives them pain, while using the product. And I find it, sometimes very hard to say no, because I know that what they're asking for is genuine, but where does it rank in the prioritization is a big task, right? So one has to be able to draw the line when it comes to customer requirements. On the other hand, when you're innovating on your own, you, of course, having your own point of view is very crucial for a well-rounded product. But then again, it has the ability to drive you in an idealistic direction. That, this is where I want to take this category, right? But you probably could be very early for the market. You probably may not, jive very well with the customer's current needs, and you're focusing probably on, what they will need, 5 years from now. So those are problems to avoid, or those are situations to avoid when you're, purely innovating on your own. And the third part, is not treating tech as, the stepchild. What tech can do to accelerate business growth, what, the new ways of development can do, what AI can do, these need to have a seat at the table so that you're at any point in time triangulating all three inputs. That, okay, this is what the customer wants, this is where the market is heading, and where I see the category needs to evolve. And this is what tech can do today because of how rapidly tech is evolving, and then come up with that common, year-on-year direction or roadmap.
Right. Interesting. So customer lifecycle management in SaaS has become so complex, right? There's so many teams involved these days, sales, pre-sales, product, customer success, etc., etc. And oftentimes the data can get siloed, right? And even the information can, there can be an asymmetry basically, right? Because the customer is talking to multiple people, and sort of bringing all of the data into one sort of a setup where you're getting the insights from the customer directly becomes very hard, especially for a product person, right? So how do you close the loop? How do you advise people in similar situations to kind of close the loop on that and really get the gist of what the customer wants from the customer itself when you have to pass through so many filters?
So I think keeping an open mind, not having very rigid views of, where a particular capability needs to go, listening to folks who are actually pseudo customers, right? So, our customer success teams, sales teams, pre-sales teams, they're almost the customer. In the absence of, true customer voice that you can listen to every day, these are the frontline warriors, if you will, who are actively, listening to the customer. They're getting the good, they're getting the bad. And that, I think, is probably, from a product development and team perspective, something that we all have to keep in mind. As a product operator, most of, my career, the one thing that I have truly benefited from is to be able to play these particular roles myself. So I've had actually the fortune to, wear all of these hats. I've done sales, I've done customer success, apart from, product responsibilities. And therefore, the perspective that you get from all of these different teams is very different when you're, sitting in a laboratory and trying to build something and imagining that this is what I, want the customer to feel. The reality could be very, very different. And, that last mile of really, did your product or did your capability hit the mark? That information comes only, with time. It only either comes from the customer or these customer facing teams that sit with you. So having that constant dialogue, knowing what they go through, knowing the type of information that comes through them, and not, building a wall around the product, but, building the product collaboratively with all of these different types of stakeholders, personally has been very, very useful. Because without that, we've had scenarios where we've, imagined a particular capability, and it has literally not, gone anywhere with the customer. And where we've, used true collaboration to build some of these capabilities, they've been sources of delight. And so I think one should take advantage of all the different type of folks that exist in the organization when it comes to, building or understanding what to build next.
Right. So you graduated from product to operations, right, in your career, and went on to be chief operating officer at SirionLabs. And SaaS, the unique thing also is that there are so many metrics and benchmarks and templates and playbooks and so many of these things, right? As an ops person, I mean, how do you look at the business? Like, how do you have like a certain template in terms of how to bring it all together, and how should one build this playbook for themselves in their own startup?
Sure. So there have been generally in my metric sheet 4 types of metrics. One, and the most important, is the stuff that I look at every day, is the churn related metrics, right? Which are the customers that could possibly churn, which are unhappy, which customers are in a place where they don't see value. That's important. So customer churn and which customers are not where they're supposed to be is one. Second is revenue churn. So customer churn is one, that, which customers are going, and then how much does that, translate into, which really, if I translate into a positive metric, it's NRR. So net revenue retention, basically, is what you're looking at. So what is coming in and what is leaving. This is the most fundamental metric that I think all SaaS companies of all types should look at. And the more carefully you look at these metrics, you're not just looking at numbers, you start to understand the whys, and you become much more, comfortable and much more stronger at stopping churn before it happens than, being completely, clueless about it. So we've, at Sirion have had very low values of, churn, because that's always been a very key focus. Customer happiness. What is the customer needing? Why is the usage not going in, the direction that it needs to? Why are more users not, getting onto the platform? Whenever we see those signs, they tell us, what are the next steps, what needs to be done. So, having that first level of metrics really detailed out into usage metrics, into, NPS, into CAS, into account health metrics, into, who are your key stakeholders, your promoters, detractors, all of that information is super important to manage on. So that's one. Second are your business metrics, right? what is your LTV, your CAC, and being able to very actively track that on a regular basis. So you understand, how profitable are you, how much effort does it take to bring in every dollar? This is important to keep an eye on because, one can completely, it could completely go out of hand. So you have to be in that frame of mind that you're building, a business that can be replicated. It's easy to bring in customers as opposed to, very expensive or very difficult. So that's second.
I like
Third
that.
is,
No, I like that you ranked customer metrics first before business metrics. I think because a lot of the times business metrics are a lagging indicator, right?
Yeah, but you know what? I think it's over time you realize that if you take care of the first,
yeah, exactly,
the second gets better and better by influence. So
right.
If your customers are happy, they will be much more referenceable. They will be in a much better space to, talk about you with other enterprises in social media. So you kind of, your world kind of revolves around that. If that happiness has been achieved, all other metrics become much easier because you don't have to spend that much effort convincing your customers to buy product. It's so there is a direct correlation to it. So I think so that I guess it's over time also because I've been in operational role that comes very naturally, that what I can do is in my hands, and then what sales has to do and what marketing has to do is separate. The third is all of your happiness metrics, right? So you're measuring your product, your NPS scores. These are very important to track. They're difficult metrics to get high numbers on. So one has to have a very clear path. The ability to track health in a proper way, I think, and health from a not just a product perspective, but the relationship health as well, right? So is the customer happy? Are the folks who are servicing the customers on your side from an ESAT perspective, are they happy? So the people-centric metrics, if you will. And the fourth are the marketing metrics. I think this is important. All the leads need to be measured. The marketing qualified leads, sales qualified leads, basically the whole end-to lead to customer, that end-to-end marketing channel needs to be measured. So generally at a high level, these are the metrics that we've always focused on and kept front and center. But then there's always a lot of depth into each of these. Each of these then get broken down into many other measures and measurements that we would do on an ongoing basis. And every department is responsible for collecting their data, which then flows up into common dashboards that tell us, okay, what is the next point of action.
Right. So I'm curious, at what point did you start building this ops function itself? Because I haven't seen too many startups start with an ops function, right? It's something that evolves once the complexity happens, right? Once there's a certain scale or so on. So at what point did you decide that, it was necessary for you guys to have an ops function?
We actually did this very early on. Literally, I think in the second year of of having customers, we built our customer success organization, all the measurements and everything in place. Because enterprise customers, even if you have 5 of them to begin with, it's a very large one, revenue that you're looking at. And second is the expectations, the number of users, the number of geographies you're covering, the expectations from different types of stakeholders, different cultures. These are all very different. So even with very few customers, it will seem like a full-fledged, you have to deliver the best outcome. So having that customer focus and all the ops, metrics in place was just had to happen very early for us. And so we've maintained that over time and only gotten more and more, detailed about it over the years.
Right. So when you work at a company for over 10 years, right? You go from, working on the same table to the same floor to perhaps multiple floors and then, multiple offices as well. And, when your team scales to that extent, right, a lot of things can break. What are the do's and don'ts of, scaling your team, scaling your culture?
See, I think first is having a very clear view that culture is important. I think many a times culture becomes an after fact. It's something which you think of as, I'm going to write my vision and mission statements, 5 things that we will, abide by. And it comes more as a marketing thing, as opposed to, what do you live by? What I've experienced, through all the startups I've been either part of or have built, is that the initial team that comes together, they drive, what are the key parameters you kind of will live by, right? Is it innovation? Is it customer focus? Is it people focus? Is it a combination of all of these 3 things? And I think you hire those type of people. You bring in, people with similar values and similar culture or cultural bent of mind. And over time, you also probably start to see that only those type of people, flock around and remain with the company. So I think having that initial focus that you want a common, a team with common values, I think is important. But when you grow in terms of numbers, right? When you're like 20, 30 people, it's easy because you're sitting with all of them, and all of that human connection solves a lot of the problems. But when you're, hundreds of people, you're distributed across the world, you're getting people from different cultures. I think at that point in time, communication becomes super important. Telling everybody what is happening, having very regular catch-ups. COVID times was special. We had daily catch-ups. We had a company town hall every day, just so we could keep everybody very, very, connected. And nobody felt that, suddenly they couldn't see anyone and they were falling off the grid. So literally for months, we would meet every day for 15 minutes and we would talk about, good things, happy things, fun things, challenges that we were solving in our individual, homes. So one has to be able to respond to scenarios and situations and keep communication at, the highest level. So nobody feels left out or not part of, the direction the ship is taking.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that I've seen is, especially like year 4 or year 5, you tend to notice a pattern in terms of who really sticks in the org, right? And that first or second level of churn has happened, and you're still perhaps tens or 100 to 200ish at this point of time, I would say, right? And but the moment that you have a full-fledged recruitment team and they're hiring like crazy, I mean, it's out of your hands, right? I mean, you can't really trust that it'll work organically. And so really identifying what are those success traits, right, that work for your organization, and then communicating it over and over again consistently, I think is super important. So you've given us tons of food for thought, right, in terms of building for the enterprise and SaaS and so on. But if I were to ask for a summary, 3-point summary for any entrepreneur who's looking to build for enterprise SaaS, what would your top 3 things be?
So 3 things. One is have patience and, the eagerness to understand the domain and the space you're in. Nothing works without that. You will be in front of, people who are masters of their space. They will be, stakeholders who've done a particular job for, 30 years. Yeah. And they expect a minimum level of understanding or a good understanding of not just what their organization needs, but the category and the space in general. So first is a lot of research, a lot of reading up, a lot of conversations, and a lot of hard work. And not just in the beginning, but, like a doctor, you read all your life. You have to just keep getting updated about the domain. Second is you're in this for the long haul. It's not a short, 6 months, 12 months, 2-year product journey. It is a product journey which could last decades, and one has to be ready to, make that personal investment and think big. You have to think about, where do I need this space to be in 5 years? What do I need my customer's value statement to be in X number of years, right? So it has to be a long-term thought through vision with the ability to realize you're heading in probably a wrong direction and pivot rapidly as well, or react to environments and changes and all of that. And the third is keep the customer at the center of what you're building. Enterprise customers are changing rapidly, and they know what they want. They don't just want a whole big platform of capabilities. They want great customer experience, engagement. They want automation. They want you to know intrinsically what their pain points are. And therefore, talking to customers regularly and being empathetic towards them. How many ever, you can have 1,000 users in one customer, but being able to understand the pattern of what their needs are and reacting accordingly, and having a roadmap that's flexible enough to keep incorporating those needs and prioritizing them, I think is very important. The customer is definitely front and center.
Yeah. No, the great thing about the enterprise that I found was that sales is a process. It doesn't happen randomly, right? I mean, there's a certain method to it. And if you kind of understand that, then a lot of things fall in place, really. So this has been a fascinating conversation. I think we've uncovered plenty of nuances with large enterprise sales and SaaS and product building and so on and so forth. Before we leave you, Kanti, what are some books or podcasts that you would recommend to our audience?
So one of the things that I'm very fascinated about is good customer experience. And a lot of where I derive my motivation from are product builders like Steve Jobs. I regularly keep going back to his video snippets all the time. I look at how different people build really lasting products, how Google did their thing, how Amazon moved from retail to enterprise. These are all very fascinating experiences for me. And I derive a lot of, my energy from, spaces like this. And I would recommend everybody definitely to watch the Startup Operator podcast that you're doing, because I think it has several candid conversations where people are actually telling you what they went through, what actually works, what does not work, and it's done in a very very nice environment where one can really open up about their particular journeys.
Thank you so much. That was very kind, and yeah, very glad to hear that. This was a fun conversation, Kanti. I know we can talk plenty, but I know we're at the top of the hour almost. I would say, right? So thank you so much again for being on the podcast, and all the best with everything that you have coming up.
Thank you so much, Roshan.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.